you're here. It's good for us to be here. It's good for us to be here. So this morning we'll continue working through It's not on? How's that? Is that better? No? Let's turn the mic up just a little bit. How's that? Better? Okay. It's good for us to be here. We'll continue working through Deuteronomy. We'll be in chapter 15, verses 1 through 10, as we make our way through. We have 3 weeks left. Well, today plus 3 weeks. So we're going to come to an end. Actually, I'm going to wrap up my study in November. Lisa and I will be at a wedding the weekend before Thanksgiving, and then we will be actually traveling the weekend after Thanksgiving. So our time together, we have 4 weeks today plus 3 more weeks. We'll work through that. Trying to decide, there's so much we can take out of Deuteronomy. So I'm trying to decide how we use those remaining 3 weeks. There's a couple of Sundays we could spend looking at worship and how God, laid down these laws, created the expectations for the Israelites relative to worship. And I think there's a lot that we could pull out from that. That would be my preference. Let me get at least a few head nods if that makes sense to you. We can do that. There are other areas that we can pull out of Deuteronomy looking at the passing of our faith from one generation to the next. Renette, that seemed to pique your interest a little bit. All right, so that can be one. That sound good? All right. That's what we'll do. But today we'll be in Deuteronomy 15. I want to read that, 15, 1 through 10. Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 10. And the context here is God has commanded the Israelites to set aside a sabbatical year. Every seventh year was to be set aside and used really as a reminder that the Israelites were God's people. And as God's people, God is trying to remind them that God is a God of grace. God is a God of grace. So God has instructed the Israelites to use this sabbatical year, every seventh year, as a reminder of grace, both the grace that God has given to them, and then in response, grace that they extend to each other, as well as grace that they may extend to foreigners living in the land. So this concept of grace demonstrated through this sabbatical every seventh year is really important. And you can see where I'm going, I think. I think there's a lot that we should pull out of this as we think about what it means for us to be God's people, living under, being the recipients of, and the beneficiaries of God's grace. And then ourselves in response, having been shown grace, how do we demonstrate grace? That's what I want us to dig into today. So, Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 10. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exclude it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess. If only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandment that I command you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you. And you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. And you shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care, lest there be any unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the seventh year, the year of release, is near, and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cried to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. For this, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. So this concept of a seventh year of forgiveness, a sabbatical, I think is rooted in grace. God is telling them, through this, I will be proclaimed. Through your grace, I will be worshiped. Your grace is necessary because you are the recipients of my grace, is essentially what God is telling them. So let's put this in context. Throughout Deuteronomy, Moses has constantly reminded the Israelites of their time in slavery in Egypt. Right? And keep in mind, this was only about 39, just shy of 40 years earlier that they came out of Egypt, having been delivered out of slavery. And Moses is desperately trying to remind them over and over and over that their delivery was by God's power and grace, not by their might or righteousness. Exodus 13:14 says, and when in time to come your sons ask you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. Exodus 13:14. God delivered the Israelites. The Israelites did nothing to deliver themselves. So, over the course of hundreds of years, if they were either sojourners or were actually slaves in Egypt, the Israelites grew both in number and might, to the point where the Egyptians, Pharaoh, became concerned that because of their number, because of their might, the Israelites may join in with Egypt's enemies and conspire against Egypt. So Pharaoh, in a matter of self-protection, was trying to guard against this ever happening. Exodus 2:23 through 25 gives us some insight into how this eventually took place, because we know that the Israelites eventually became enslaved to Egypt. So Exodus 2:23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. I think it's a key word, groaning. It gives us some insight into how bad things were. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God saw this. He knew what was happening. He heard their pleas. So over time, beginning at the death of Joseph, over time, Pharaoh's heart became hardened against the Israelites. So Exodus chapter 5 actually records an incident where Moses and Aaron approach Pharaoh asking for 3 days of liberty, so that the Israelites could go into the wilderness and worship God. And Pharaoh uses this as an excuse to increase their burdens. Right? Pharaoh uses this as a way of saying, you must have it too good. We're being too easy on you. Otherwise, you wouldn't have even thought to request 3 days of liberty. So, I'm going to make it worse. I'm going to make sure you understand who's boss. I'm going to keep your quota for making brick, the same. But now you have to not only make the brick, but you have to gather the straw needed to make the brick. And the quota is the same. So, Pharaoh used their request as an excuse to increase their workload. And in that, life just became that much more miserable for Israel. to the point where Pharaoh then instructs his taskmasters to beat the Israelite foreman when the Israelite workers failed to meet their quota. I mean, it became this vicious cycle. Israel had no way of meeting the quota. And Pharaoh, I assume out of self-interest, self-protection, let's assume he sincerely believed the Israelites were a political threat. Pharaoh used this as a way of keeping the Israelites beat down. Right? He kept them enslaved by increasing their quotas. So then in Exodus chapter 5, verse 22, we see where Moses then intercedes for Israel. And Moses' words are strong, even accusatory. But Moses approaches God, Exodus 5, verse 22. Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. And you," keep in mind, this is Moses talking to God, "and you have not delivered your people at all." Moses is accusing God of failing his people. Moses is accusing God of essentially failing to keep his promise. It's strong language, but that gives us insight into the degree to which Israel had become enslaved to Egypt. Now, in Exodus chapter 6, literally the next verse after that conversation takes place, God responds. Exodus 6, verse 1. "But the Lord said to Moses, 'Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land.'" So God says, "Moses, I hear you. In my time, now you're going to see what happens next." The next few chapters record God delivering the 10 plagues on Egypt, ultimately resulting in that 10th plague, which was death of the firstborn, children and cattle. So if you think, and that's significant, right? If you think back 2 or 3 Sundays ago when we asked the question, why would the Israelites form a golden calf? And the response was some of those Egyptian gods took the form of cow, calf, bull. So, it made sense. But here God's plague on the firstborn is not just of the children, which affected Pharaoh in the death of his own firstborn, but it affected it caused the death of the livestock and the firstborn of those livestock. So it's kind of hitting Egypt with a double whammy, right? Not just your own firstborn, but the firstborn of the livestock, which you often hold up as a god for yourself. Right? God is not just demonstrating his power over the people. God is demonstrating his power over the gods that Egypt held for themselves to begin with. It's a real double whammy. So, with the end of this plague, Pharaoh temporarily at least relents and releases Egypt. We talked a few weeks ago. Egypt was desperate for Israel to leave. Israel plundered Egypt on the way out. In other words, they took with them everything they could collect, right? Egypt was giving them treasure in order to leave. So it's with this that Israel begins their journey out of Egypt. Now, I think it's important for us to think about this concept of slavery, because without an understanding of the slavery, then we, I think, fail to recognize the extent of the grace that followed. So let's think just a few minutes about the slavery, right? It's easy, we get it. There was a physical aspect to the slavery. Israel lived under Egypt's brutality for decades. We just talked about how Pharaoh had increased their workload without increasing the resources to go along with it. So there is a physical aspect to the slavery. But I think it would be a mistake if we also fail to recognize that there's a psychological aspect to slavery. It's not just forcing someone to do the work for you. It's owning that person in body and in mind and spirit. It's breaking that person down generation after generation after generation. It gets to this concept of owning someone. Not just ruling out of fear. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to beat you. But it's ruling out of authority. Ruling by beating them down. Ruling by weakening them physically, emotionally, spiritually. You know, I've shared with you, we have 2 sons, and sometimes their sense of humor kind of gets in the way. But what they say sometimes is really funny. My older son, at one point, he thought one of the funniest things in the world was the phrase, "The beating shall continue until morale improves." He really thought that was funny, but it gets to the point. It gets to the point. It's not just a physical enslavement. It is a psychological enslavement as well. And again, I think we have to recognize that, because when we understand the extent of the slavery, then we understand the magnitude of the grace. The other thing it helps us understand is in God's time, God delivered the Israelites when they were at their lowest. They were the group of people, while large in number, they were the group of people who would be least likely voted to succeed. Right? They had no power to influence their own situation. They had no ability to save themselves. That's why I think it's interesting, going back to Exodus 6, verse 1, when God responds to Moses, he said, "Now you shall see. Now is the time. Now you will see what I'm going to do." Because Moses had just made it clear, we're at the bottom. And this idea of, frankly, a uniquely American idea, I think, of us looking at it and saying, well, can't they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps? This idea of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, it just isn't going to work. We don't have bootstraps to pull ourselves up by. So Moses has approached God saying, how have you allowed us to be put in this position? We've hit bottom. And God said, now you will see. Now is the time. Yeah, you're right. And I debated how much to linger on this idea. And I'll tell you why, is that I'm sensitive to the reality that we all come to God with a different history. We all come to God with certain baggage, very personal, individual baggage. We all have baggage. Your baggage may be different than mine. Your baggage is different than mine. Frankly, your baggage may be heavier than mine. So, Keith, you understand now the sensitivity to which I want to recognize your comment, but I think it's sensitive when you go back to the core of why we're studying Deuteronomy in the first place. It's to bring out those nuggets of wisdom. And how does what happened in Deuteronomy with the Israelites, how do we find parallel with that and apply it in our own lives? And some of that may be, well, it all will be individual, but some of it may be very painful. It will. We've all heard stories of someone trying to share the gospel and the recipient says, I'm past the point of saving. What I've done is too bad for God to forgive me. Jack, I think you've shared with me stories where someone has told you that in your efforts to share the gospel with them. But that I'm glad you brought it up, because that gets to the heart of where Israel actually is. They believe they are unsavable. And again, back to the point, that's when God says, now is the time. Now is actually the time, because you think you're unsavable. That's the door I have, God speaking. That's the door that's been opened to me to demonstrate my power. Essentially, God is saying, you're right, Israel. You are unsavable. You can't do this on your own. But I'm not you. I have power that you don't. I have power that you don't even understand. And I'm trying to give it away. Trying to give it away. And all God asks of them, all God asks of us is to accept it. And then live lives that appreciate the gift we've been given. So, that's where we are. God delivers Israel. The parallel there is, I think, obvious. Just as God delivered Israel from slavery, God delivers us from that slavery of sin, to use the metaphor. And there we are. Galatians 4:21 through 31. I think this is interesting because it ties back. Galatians 4:21 through 31. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman, one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother, for it is written, Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. I kind of stumbled across this actually in my readings this past week. To be honest, it's not a verse or passage that immediately came to mind. But that's it. That's exactly it. We are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. And that brings us full circle back to grace, which is where we started this morning. God's grace made Israel free. God's grace makes us free. For Israel, it was freedom from their Egyptian captivity. For us, it's freedom from sin. Now, I get it. This is not new material for most of us. Hopefully, it's a useful reminder. But what I want you to come away with this morning is, in some small way, I hope you're in awe of what's happening. I hope you're in awe of the fact that we are made free. And by in awe, I mean more excited than you could ever be, and more humbled than you can ever imagine. We're free. Matt.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth calling out. This passage you just shared is a great proof text for how to interpret Revelation 12. And we went there, if you remember. It's also a great connection between the woman here, which is referencing to Sarah, but is really referencing the old covenant. Transitions to the new covenant under Jesus. And Revelation 12 explains that whole transition with the woman as an analogy or the allegory. And why do I say that? Because I think, when you've been talking about Deuteronomy, this remembrance of what God's done from slavery to the cross is a fantastic nugget of wisdom, to use your word. But the same thing then is applied to the New Testament. And so to your point, we need to be thinking about ourselves as what God has done for us spiritually, where we were under slavery, and He's made us, given us a promise, eternal salvation. That is just beautiful.
Yeah. It's the same God. All that's changed is the definition of slavery. But it's the same God. The same grace, the same delivery. Any other comments? Yep, Dan.
As we think about the passage, we're looking at Deuteronomy 15 this morning and thinking about also the words that were given about looking out for those that were poor. As we look at the passage you just read in Galatians, we go a little bit further down in Galatians 5. For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that relates directly back to what we read in Deuteronomy 15.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Even some of the 10 Commandments, they were based on the same thing: love God, love others. It comes back to the same very simple, very succinct commandment. And Matt, that's the point, I think, part of the point you're trying to make either. It is the same God. He's not asking for anything different from us as what He did with the Israelites. The same God, it's the same request and the same demonstration of grace. Right? Maybe the teacher does somehow benefit more than the student in a class. But one of the things I've come away with is how simple the message actually is. It's simple. The Lord is God. God loves me. And I know that God loves me because he demonstrated his love. God's grace is unconditional. God then promises blessings. God's blessings are conditional. And he asks for my obedience. But he's not asking me for anything he hasn't already demonstrated. What's the greatest commandment? Love God. Second greatest, love others. God's already demonstrated the love. He's not asking for something that he didn't do himself. He's not asking for something that he hasn't already demonstrated. When God asked the Israelites through this sabbatical year to be graceful, when God asks us to be graceful, it's because God was first graceful. And he demonstrated that grace through Christ. I've come away with this simplicity of the message. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Any other comments? All right. Maybe I waited too long. There we are. So I think there's 4 questions that we should keep in mind. We've touched on these, but I want to summarize them. How similar are we to the Israelites in our need for deliverance? These are almost rhetorical questions at this point. How similar are we to the Israelites in our need for deliverance? How similar are we to the Israelites in our ability to save ourselves? How similar to the Israelites are we in remembering or forgetting God's proactive extension of grace? And then how similar to the Israelites are we in extending grace to others? Ouch. 4 key questions. Let's move on. I think there are 3 key ideas for us to take out of Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 10. The first is that our gracefulness is a response to God's proactive grace. And the word proactive there is key. Again, God is not asking us to be graceful when he has not shown grace prior. God's only asking us to be graceful in response to the grace we have already received. So Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 8, actually, if you extend our text a little bit, covers this a little bit more. But one of the things that stands out actually is verse 2. So this extension of grace was directly tied to God's release of Israel's debts. And in that sense, the ask of Israel to be graceful through this sabbatical year, the release of creditors, the release of debtors, it was a way of Israel constantly being reminded that they themselves were released. And again, the parallel, a way for us to be reminded that we have been released. And so in that sense, my head goes to our weekly participation in communion. It's the same thing, and then it's an active participation intentionally designed to be a reminder of grace. It's an active participation intentionally designed to be a reminder of grace demonstrated by God to us. 1 Corinthians 11:26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. We don't sing it very often, but it reminded me of a song. He paid a debt he did not owe. I owe a debt I could not pay. I needed Jesus to wash my sins away. Dan?
1 John 3:16, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers.
Exactly. God's proactive grace. Key idea number 2. God's grace bonds together those who have received it. God's grace bonds together those who have received it. So here's where I'm coming from in this. Just as Israel, as a nation, shared in suffering, as a nation they were enslaved to Egypt. That was a common characteristic. Brother understood the misery that their brother was facing. They shared this collective experience in slavery. They understood the suffering on a national level. And getting back to this idea of the slavery would have been not just physical, but psychological. It became part of how Israel thought of themselves. This concept of having suffered, this concept of being a victim became who they were, how they thought of themselves. This reminds me of Romans 3:23. All have sinned. We all share that common characteristic. 1 John 1:8. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. We share that common characteristic. We don't talk about it in terms of our shared suffering. We don't talk about it in terms of our shared slavery to sin. But if you draw the parallels between Deuteronomy and us, I think it's appropriate. I think it fits. Maybe one of the reasons we don't talk about it is it doesn't hurt bad enough. Israel hurt. They were in pain due to the physical labor imposed on them by Egypt. They knew what it meant to bear the burden of their slavery. Maybe we somehow fail to fully understand, fully appreciate, fully comprehend the burden of our slavery to sin. But it's there, and we share that. I'm not going to read it because of the length, but Ephesians 4:1-6 supports this notion. Just make a note. Ephesians 4:1-6. It supports this notion of unity. Unity both in our slavery to sin, also unity in our redemption through Christ. Right? That's the other side of that coin. If we share the burden of slavery, then we also share in being recipients of God's grace and the deliverance that occurs. Man.
I love this, and one tangible example is when Sandy and I lived in London, we worshipped at the Wimbledon Church of Christ. And you think, okay, London, England, we probably worshiping with a bunch of British. Mm-hmm. But you know what? There was only one lady that was actually native to England. There was us. We were Americans. There was two families that were always there in Ghana. There's one family from Trinidad and Tobago. There's one family from Malta, and there's one family from Nigeria. And we all got together. And we always spent, we didn't have Sunday evening services, but we'd have worship in the morning. We met at the YMCA in Wimbledon. And then we would go out and have lunch somewhere and just spend some time. London has lots of nice parks. We just spend time together in the park.
So you were celebrating the unity.
Yeah, that's right. It was really special. We were tiny, and we were forced to have to rotate between.
Yeah.
One of us would do the lesson, one of us would do the Lord's Supper, one of us would be the song leader, and one person would have the prayer. And it's just, but it was great.
Well, Lisa and I kind of saw the same thing when we lived in New England, right? The approach to church is a little different there because you just don't have options, not like you have here in the South. So God's grace binds us together. The third big idea I want us to understand is that God's grace is a matter of heart and action. And to talk about this, I think it's helpful for us to understand this idea of family. Deuteronomy 15. So, for example, Deuteronomy 15:7. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. So Moses is already introducing this idea of family into the discussion. And it's a very useful concept because we understand family. We understand that parents make sacrifice out of grace for the benefit of their children, understanding that the child is in no way able to support themselves, provide for themselves. The children are completely dependent on the parent to do this. The parent does this sometimes as a matter of obligation, but a lot of times as a matter of honor. It's a privilege for the parent to demonstrate grace to the child. We understand that it's not just a physical providing, but a godly family will emotionally provide for each other. And sometimes that emotional maturity that comes is understanding that I may have to diminish myself in order to increase a family member. It's for the greater good. So this idea of family is strong, but it's as a similarity, it's useful because we understand that it's not just the action of being graceful, it's the attitude behind it. I need to wrap up. Verse 9, Deuteronomy 15, verse 9, take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart. You don't do this out of compulsion. If we're godly, we do it out of love because that's how God demonstrated his grace. It was out of love, and I am out of time.